A young girl was left to freeze in the woods, abandoned to the mercy of nature's cruelest season. The mountain man, weathered and isolated from society, found her trembling form among the snow-laden pines and refused to let go of the small life fate had placed in his calloused hands. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wind screamed through the pines above Pine Brook as Mary Johnson stumbled in the darkness, her thin coat no match for the biting cold. The 15-year-old's teeth chattered uncontrollably as she pushed forward, away from the place she was supposed to call home. Behind her, the distant laughter of her foster parents echoed between the trees, a cruel reminder that she'd been cast aside again. "You're nothing but trouble," they had shouted before locking the door. Mary had stood on the porch for nearly an hour, hoping they would relent, but the lights inside had eventually gone dark. They knew exactly what they were doing, abandoning her to the freezing night. Her breath came in ragged clouds as she wrapped her arms tightly around herself. The worn boots barely protected her feet from the creeping frost, each step sending painful shivers up her legs. The darkness of the woods seemed to close in around her, the moonlight barely penetrating the dense canopy of pine branches. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice lost in the howling wind. But where was she going? Pine Brook was miles from any neighboring town, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Mary had no phone, no money, and no one who would miss her. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself wanted to swallow her whole. The snow had begun falling again, delicate flakes catching in her eyelashes and melting against her feverish cheeks. How long had she been walking? Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to blur together in the cold. Mary's legs finally buckled beneath her. She collapsed under a snow-laden pine, its branches hanging low like protective arms. Her fingers had gone numb, and a dangerous warmth began to spread through her body. The deceptive comfort that comes before freezing to death. She thought of all the homes she'd cycled through, all the families who had promised to care for her. 6 foster homes in 3 years, each one worse than the last. The social worker's sympathetic but helpless expression. The system that had failed her repeatedly. With nowhere left to run and no strength to continue, Mary curled into herself beneath the tree. The world began to blur at the edges, darkness creeping into her vision. The cold no longer felt painful, just a gentle numbness spreading through her limbs. As consciousness began to slip away, a single tear froze against her cheek. The woods of Pine Brook would become her final resting place, she thought, unless someone found her soon. But who would look for a forgotten foster child in the middle of a winter night? As Mary's consciousness faded, she heard a peculiar sound, hooves crunching on the icy ground. The rhythm was steady, purposeful, cutting through the howling wind that had been her only companion for hours. Was she dreaming, or was the forest offering one last trick before the end? Her eyelids fluttered, too heavy to stay open, as the cold continued its relentless assault on her fragile body. Then, out of the shadows came Robert Brown, known in Pine Brook as the reclusive mountain man. His weathered face, lined by years of solitude and harsh winters, peered through the darkness with practiced eyes. Robert had lived alone in these woods for so long that he developed a sixth sense for disturbances in his domain. Tonight something had pulled him from his cabin, a feeling of desperation he couldn't ignore. The horse beneath him nickered softly, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Robert patted its neck reassuringly as he scanned the tree line. That's when he spotted Mary Johnson's small, crumpled figure at the base of a massive pine. The teenager was barely visible beneath the growing blanket of snow, her thin coat offering little protection against the merciless cold. "Dear God," he whispered, dismounting with surprising agility for a man who preferred the company of mountains to people. Robert rushed to her side, his heart pounding with urgency. He knelt beside the girl, noting her blue-tinged lips and shallow breath. Years of survival in these unforgiving woods had taught him to recognize death's approach, and it was circling Mary like a hungry predator. Robert pressed 2 fingers against her neck, feeling a faint pulse struggling beneath her icy skin. The mountain man removed his thick fur-lined coat without hesitation, wrapping it around Mary's limp form. Her foster parents' neglect was evident in her inadequate clothing and the desperate flight that had brought her deep into these dangerous woods. "Hold on," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. The survivalist lifted Mary as gently as possible, cradling her slight frame against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, a fact that stirred something protective in the usually detached man. Robert carefully mounted his horse, adjusting Mary securely in front of him. The animal seemed to sense the urgency, standing perfectly still until its master gave the command to move. As they turned toward his cabin, Robert tightened his grip on the reins, determination setting his jaw. Pine Brook might have forgotten this child, but the mountain wouldn't claim her tonight, not while Robert Brown had anything to say about it. Robert Brown wrapped Mary Johnson in his thick woolen coat, his weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness. The girl weighed almost nothing in his arms, her small frame as fragile as a fallen bird. He lifted her with the careful precision he normally reserved for wounded animals he'd find in his traps, creatures deserving of mercy rather than suffering. "Easy now," he whispered, more to himself than to her unconscious form. The mountain man secured Mary across his sturdy horse, positioning her so she wouldn't slip during the journey back. The animal snorted, its breath forming dense clouds in the frigid air. Robert patted its neck reassuringly before mounting behind the girl, one arm keeping her steady against him. He looked up at the vast, indifferent sky above Pine Brook Woods, stars glittering like ice crystals against the darkness. "Not tonight," he murmured to the mountain that had claimed so many lives before. "Not on my watch." The ride back to his cabin was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the rhythmic crunching of hooves on snow and the occasional moan of wind through the pines. Mary's breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps against his chest, each one a small victory against the encroaching cold. Robert kept his eyes forward, scanning the familiar path while his mind raced. Who would abandon a child to the merciless winter? The thought kindled a rare anger in him, though his face remained impassive. He'd seen the cruelty of Pine Brook before. It was partly why he'd retreated to the solitude of the mountains years ago. Every step his horse took felt like a race against time. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the girl's skin had already taken on the bluish tinge that preceded frostbite. Robert hunched forward, trying to shield her from the wind with his body. He'd seen what the cold could do to people, how it stole life slowly, almost peacefully, until nothing remained. "Stay with me," he urged quietly, when Mary's breathing faltered momentarily. The words sounded strange in his throat, unused to speaking aloud after so many solitary months. The lights of his cabin finally appeared through the trees, a single beacon in the vast darkness. Robert felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a determination that went beyond simple duty. This girl deserved a chance, and he was suddenly certain that keeping her alive mattered more than anything had in a very long time. The mountain man tightened his grip on Mary as they approached the cabin, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. The cold would not claim another soul tonight. Mary Johnson awoke in a haze, her mind struggling to piece together where she was. The warmth of a roaring fire caressed her skin, while the weight of heavy blankets pressed against her frozen limbs, sensations so foreign they almost hurt. The last thing she remembered was collapsing in the snow, the cold seeping into her bones as darkness claimed her. She blinked several times, confused by the rough-hewn wooden ceiling above her. Was she safe, or simply lost in another dream before death took her? The teenager tried to sit up, but her body protested with sharp aches that confirmed she was very much alive. Across the small cabin, Robert Brown sat hunched on a wooden stool, his weathered hands tending to a battered kettle on an ancient cast-iron stove. The mountain man moved with practiced efficiency, his broad shoulders blocking much of the firelight as he worked. Steam rose in lazy spirals as he poured hot water into a chipped mug. Mary watched him cautiously, years in foster care having taught her that kindness often came with conditions. She pulled the blankets tight around herself, creating a barrier between her vulnerability and this stranger who had apparently saved her life. The floorboards creaked as he approached, and she instinctively tensed. Robert seemed to notice, stopping a respectful distance away. His eyes, deep-set beneath a furrowed brow, held no judgment, only quiet concern. He didn't ask questions or pry into why a young girl was freezing to death in the woods. Instead, he simply nodded at her, extending the steaming mug of tea with calloused hands. The gesture was offered without expectation, without demands for explanation or gratitude. The cabin remained silent except for the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. This solitary man seemed comfortable with the quiet in a way Mary had never experienced before. Most adults filled silence with accusations or false promises. She hesitated before accepting the mug, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his. The tea was dark and smelled of pine and something earthy she couldn't identify. Its warmth spread through her hands and into her core as she took a tentative sip. Robert returned to his stool, giving her space while remaining present. He picked up a small piece of wood and a knife, whittling away with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythmic scraping sound became oddly comforting as Mary sipped her tea, her body gradually remembering what warmth felt like. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't being asked to explain herself or justify her existence. In this stranger's cabin, miles from Pine Brook and her latest failed foster home, Mary found something unexpected, a moment of peace. The silence inside the cabin was different from the silence of the woods. This quiet was filled with care, an unspoken promise that she was safe, at least for now. Mary Johnson barely dared to breathe, afraid it would all vanish if she acknowledged its presence. The crackling of the fire provided a gentle soundtrack to her recovery, so unlike the howling wind that had nearly claimed her life. "You should eat something," Robert Brown said, placing a bowl of steaming stew before her. His voice was rough from disuse, yet somehow gentle. The mountain man moved with deliberate care around his modest cabin, never making sudden movements that might startle her. Mary took the bowl with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. How long had it been since someone had cared whether she ate? As the days passed, Robert became a steady presence in her healing. He didn't smother her with pity or uncomfortable questions about her past, nor did he ignore her presence, treating her as just another burden to bear. Instead, he simply ensured she was warm, fed, and rested, allowing her to heal at her own pace. On the third morning, Mary found the courage to venture from beneath her pile of furs to sit by the stove. Robert nodded approvingly but said nothing. He handed her a cup of hot tea and returned to mending a torn shirt. "Do you want me to help?" she asked, her voice stronger than before. The survivalist looked up, something like surprise flickering across his weathered face. "If you'd like," he replied, offering her a needle and thread. Their days fell into a simple rhythm. Robert would rise before dawn, stoke the fire and prepare a modest breakfast. Mary would join him, gradually taking on small tasks around the cabin. They spoke little, but the silence no longer frightened her. One evening, as snow piled against the windows, Mary watched her rescuer carefully cleaning his tools. His hands, rough and calloused, moved with surprising gentleness. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked, the question that had burned inside her since she'd awakened in his cabin. Robert paused, considering her words. "The mountain doesn't ask who deserves saving," he said simply. "Neither do I." Mary nodded, understanding flowing between them. In Pine Brook, people had always wanted something in return for their help. Their kindness came with conditions. But here in this small cabin with this quiet man, she was learning that some people gave simply because they could. For the first time since being abandoned in the freezing woods, Mary allowed herself to believe that perhaps this safety might last. One afternoon, as snow fell softly outside, Robert Brown stood by the cabin window, his weathered face contemplative as he watched the white flakes dance in the wind. He turned to Mary Johnson, who sat huddled near the fire, her thin frame still not fully recovered from her ordeal in the woods. "Today you learn to read the mountain," he said, his voice low but clear. "It speaks to those who listen." Mary looked up, uncertainty flickering across her face. The cabin had become a sanctuary, but the thought of venturing out into the snow again made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Still, something in Robert's steady gaze gave her pause. Unlike her foster parents, who had abandoned her to the elements, this mountain man offered knowledge instead of judgment. They bundled up in layers of clothing, Robert ensuring Mary was properly protected against the cold. Outside, the world was transformed into a pristine white canvas. Robert knelt beside a set of tiny impressions in the snow. "Rabbit," he explained, tracing the pattern with his gloved finger. See how the back feet land ahead of the front? That's how you know. Mary nodded, trying to commit the pattern to memory. Her hands trembled, partly from cold and partly from the lingering fear that had become her constant companion. As they moved deeper into the woods, Robert showed her how to identify trees that would yield dry wood even after snowfall. Look for the dead branches that don't touch the ground, he instructed, breaking off a piece to demonstrate how it snapped cleanly, without dampness. Mary attempted to mimic his movements, but her first tries were clumsy. The branch she selected was too green, bending rather than breaking. Frustration colored her cheeks. "Try again," Robert said simply, without a hint of impatience. They continued through the afternoon, Robert pointing out fox tracks, showing her how to recognize the north side of trees by the pattern of moss growth, teaching her to listen for the hollow sound of frozen streams beneath the snow. At first Mary stumbled, her confidence as fragile as thin ice, but with each small success, correctly identifying deer tracks, finding a perfectly dry branch, her posture straightened ever so slightly. Robert didn't praise excessively or criticize her mistake. His teaching style was as straightforward as the man himself, honest, practical, and surprisingly gentle. His quiet confidence began to affect Mary, seeping into her bones more effectively than any motivational speech. By the time they returned to the cabin, Mary's hands had stopped shaking. She carried an armful of dry wood, a small victory that meant more than Robert could know. For the first time since arriving at his doorstep, she felt something beyond mere survival, a flicker of capability, of worth. The morning dawned crisp and clear, marking 7 days since Mary Johnson had arrived at the cabin. Outside, frost clung to the pines, but inside the fire crackled with steady warmth. Robert Brown had been observing her recovery with quiet satisfaction, noting how her hands had stopped trembling, and her eyes had begun to hold his gaze. After breakfast he disappeared into the back room, returning with something wrapped in a worn cloth. Mary looked up from the kettle she was tending, curiosity flickering across her face. "Been meaning to give you this," Robert said, his voice low but steady as he unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a small, sturdy knife with a wooden handle polished smooth by years of use. "You'll need it out here." Mary hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers hovering above the blade. The mountain man nodded encouragingly. "It was my first," he explained, watching as she carefully lifted it. "Served me well for many winters." The weight of the knife felt strange in her palm, not just the physical heft, but the weight of what it represented. No one had ever trusted her with something so valuable, so potentially dangerous. In her previous homes, drawers containing even butter knives had been locked, as if she couldn't be trusted with anything sharper than a spoon. "I don't know how to use it properly," she admitted, turning the blade in the firelight. Robert settled onto a nearby stool. "I'll teach for cutting rope, skinning game, whittling wood when the nights get long." He paused, his weathered face softening slightly. "Everyone needs their own tools up here." Mary ran her thumb along the blunt edge of the handle, feeling the subtle grooves where countless fingers had gripped before hers. This wasn't just any tool, it was Robert's, something he'd carried and relied upon. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the emotion swelling in her chest. This simple object represented something she'd never truly experienced before. Trust. The knife wasn't just for protection or survival. It was Robert's way of saying he believed she belonged here, that she was capable. That evening, he showed her how to hold it properly, how to care for the blade, and the respect it demanded. Mary listened intently, absorbing every word. When he demonstrated a simple whittling technique, she mimicked his movements with careful precision. Later, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Mary sat by the fire, the knife resting in her lap. For the first time since she could remember, someone had given her not charity or pity, but dignity, a chance to be more than just a burden. In the dancing flames, she saw possibilities she'd never dared imagine before. Perhaps here, in this remote cabin, with this quiet man, she might finally find her place in the world. Despite the warmth and safety of Robert's cabin, Mary Johnson's nightmares refused to release their grip. The crackling fire and sturdy walls kept the physical cold at bay, but they couldn't shield her from the memories that haunted her sleep. She would often jolt awake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, the phantom sensation of snow against her skin making her shiver, despite the heavy blankets. On those nights, Mary would silently slip from her makeshift bed and curl up beside the fireplace. The dancing flames became her silent companion as she hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, a habit formed from years of trying to disappear in foster homes where she never truly belonged. Robert noticed, of course, the mountain man's keen senses, honed by years of solitary survival, alerted him to her midnight vigils. Yet he never intruded, understanding that some battles needed to be fought alone before they could be shared. One particularly harsh night, as wind howled against the cabin walls like angry wolves, Mary sat staring into the embers. The red glow illuminated her face, revealing tracks of silent tears she couldn't hold back anymore. "I keep waiting," she whispered when she sensed Robert's presence behind her. Her voice was barely audible above the crackling wood. He settled beside her, not too close, respecting the invisible boundaries she kept around herself. "Waiting for what?" he asked, his deep voice gentle. Mary swallowed hard. "For you to realize I'm just a burden. For you to leave me behind like everyone else." The confession tumbled out, raw and honest. "My foster parents said I was too much trouble, not worth the government checks." She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of the borrowed shirt that hung loosely on her thin frame. "They drove me to the edge of the woods and told me to wait. Said they'd come back." Her voice cracked. "They never did." Robert remained still, his weathered face revealing nothing, but his eyes reflected a pain that matched her own. "I keep thinking you'll do the same," Mary continued. "Find me too troublesome. Decide I'm not worth the extra food or firewood." She stared at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I wouldn't blame you. I don't know how to be anything but a burden." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the popping of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Mary braced herself for confirmation of her deepest fears, her shoulders tensing as if preparing to absorb another blow from a world that had never shown her kindness. Robert didn't respond with empty words or hollow reassurances. The mountain man had never been one for speeches, finding more truth in actions than in carefully crafted sentences. He rose from his chair, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and disappeared into the shadowy corner of the cabin where he kept his most precious possessions. Mary Johnson sat by the fire, her thin fingers trembling slightly as she waited. The confession had left her feeling exposed, like a wound reopened to the bitter air. Every home before had been temporary, every connection severed when she became inconvenient. Why would this cabin in the wilderness be any different? When Robert returned, his arms were laden with a bundle of carefully preserved furs and hand-stitched cloths. Some looked worn but well cared for, others newer but equally treasured. He placed them beside her with unexpected gentleness for a man with such weathered hands. "There's no such thing as too much warmth," he said quietly, his voice barely rising above the crackling fire. "We keep what we need, and we share what we can." The teenager ran her fingers across the soft pelts, feeling their history beneath her touch. These weren't just materials for survival, they represented years of Robert's life in the mountains, his solitary existence before she had crashed into it. "I don't understand," she whispered, though something deeper than understanding was already taking root inside her. Robert settled back into his chair, taking time to find the right words. "These mountains," he began, gesturing toward the window where snow continued to fall in the darkness, "they take from you if you're not careful. They take your warmth, your hope, sometimes your life." He paused, poking at the fire with a stick. "But they also teach you what matters." Mary wrapped one of the furs around her shoulders, its weight somehow both substantial and comforting. Unlike her foster parents who had abandoned her to the freezing woods, Robert gave without calculation, without keeping score. "You don't owe me anything," he added, as if reading her thought. "That's not how this works." The girl nodded, tears threatening but not falling. In the Pinebrook foster home, everything had come with conditions, with expectations she could never quite meet. Here, in this simple cabin with this quiet man, she was learning a different way to exist. The fire popped and hissed as a log settled. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but it couldn't touch them now. Mary pulled the fur tighter around herself, understanding for the first time what true shelter felt like. Not just walls and a roof, but the safety of unconditional care. The mountain air grew sharper as January deepened, but inside Robert Brown's cabin, something was changing. Mary Johnson no longer huddled by the fire with that haunted look in her eyes. Each morning she rose with purpose, her movements more deliberate, more confident. "I'll get the kindling today," she announced one morning, pulling on the thick wool socks Robert had given her. Her voice, once barely audible, now carried across the small cabin with conviction. Robert nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his weathered face. He watched as she wrapped herself in layers before heading out, noticing how she now moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the mountain's dangers. When she returned, arms laden with perfectly selected dry wood, her cheeks were flushed, not just from cold, but from accomplishment. The teenager who had been left to freeze in the woods was finding her strength. "You've got a good eye," Robert said, accepting the bun. "Pick the cedar pieces too. They'll burn hot." Mary's eyes brightened at the praise. She moved to the stove, now familiar with its temperamental nature, and began preparing their morning tea without being asked. As days stretched into weeks, their routine evolved. Mary learned to mend tears in their clothing, her fingers growing steadier with each stitch. She mastered the art of boiling pine needle tea when their regular supplies ran low. Most importantly, she began to anticipate needs rather than simply responding to them. One evening, as heavy snow blanketed the woods outside, Robert returned from checking his traps to find Mary had already stoked the fire, prepared a simple stew, and laid out dry clothes for him. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, removing his snow-covered boots. "You would have done the same," she replied simply, ladling the hot stew into a bowl. The mountain man observed her quietly. The girl who had arrived half-dead at his doorstep now moved with intention. Her frame, though still slight, had developed a wiry strength. More remarkable was the change in her eyes. Where fear had once dominated, determination now resided. That night, as they sat by the fire, Robert taught her to whittle wood, his calloused hands guiding hers on a small piece of pine. Her concentration was absolute, her patience surprising even herself. "You're becoming a true mountain woman," Robert remarked, not one for excessive praise. Mary didn't respond with words, but the slight straightening of her shoulders spoke volumes. In the heart of winter, surrounded by snow and isolation, she was blooming, finding pieces of herself she never knew existed, building strength from the very cold that had nearly claimed her life. The winter days fell into a comfortable rhythm for Mary Johnson and Robert Brown. Each morning they rose with the pale mountain sun, sharing a simple breakfast of whatever the previous day's hunt had provided. What had once been awkward silence between them had transformed into a companionable quiet, broken only by the occasional instruction or question. "You need to check the snares every day," Robert explained, showing Mary how to properly set the wire loops that would catch rabbits without damaging the valuable fur. "Animals can sense when something's not right with their surroundings. The trick is making your trap seem like it belongs there." Mary nodded, her fingers growing more confident with each attempt. The sturdy knife Robert had given her became an extension of her hand, as she learned to whittle triggers for deadfall traps and clean their modest catches. She no longer flinched when skinning rabbits or preparing meat for smoking, tasks that would have horrified her just weeks before. "These roots are safe," the mountain man would say, pointing to specific plants half buried in snow. "These ones will make you sick." Mary absorbed every lesson, mentally cataloging the difference between life-sustaining flora and dangerous lookalikes. On particularly clear days, they ventured further from the cabin, and Robert taught her to read the forest. "See those broken branches? Something large passed through here recently." Or, "That's a fox print. They're solitary hunters like me." He never mentioned her past or pressed her about the future. In his quiet way, he focused only on the present, on survival. Mary found herself standing taller with each small accomplishment. The first time she successfully tracked and caught a snowshoe hare without Robert's help, she returned to the cabin with her prize, a smile breaking across her face that felt foreign yet wonderful. "You've got good instincts," was all Robert said, but the approval in his eyes meant more than flowery praise. At night, They would sit by the fire mending clothes or carving tools. Mary's nightmares came less frequently now. When they did arrive, she would wake to find the fire stoked and a fresh cup of pine needle tea waiting. Robert's wordless acknowledgement of her struggle. With each passing day, Mary reclaimed another piece of herself from the darkness that had nearly consumed her that night in the woods. The girl who had been discarded, left to freeze, was becoming something else entirely, someone who could survive, who could contribute, who belonged. Not as a burden, but as a partner in this quiet mounting existence. The knife skills, the trapping knowledge, the ability to find food where others would see nothing. These weren't just survival lessons, they were promises that she would never be helpless again. But winter in the mountains is unforgiving. The harsh reality of Pinebrook's wilderness became painfully clear one frigid morning when Robert Brown set out on his usual hunting route. Mary Johnson watched him disappear into the tree line, his sturdy figure growing smaller against the vast white landscape. He promised to return before sunset with fresh game for their evening meal. As daylight began to fade and the cabin's wooden clock ticked past the expected hour of his return, an uneasy feeling settled in Mary's stomach. She stoked the fire in the stove, adding the last logs from the indoor pile, and peered anxiously through the frost-covered window. The mountain man was nowhere to be seen. "He'll be back soon," she whispered to herself, trying to quell the rising panic. But as darkness enveloped the cabin and the wind howled with increasing ferocity, her reassurances rang hollow. Mary paced the wooden floor, her footsteps creating a nervous rhythm that echoed through the small space. Each creak of the cabin's timbers made her heart leap with hope, only to crash back down when no door opened. The hours stretched painfully as she waited, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. Had Robert been injured? Lost his war? The thought that terrified her most. Had he simply abandoned her like everyone else in her life? Her foster parents had left her to freeze in these very woods. Perhaps Robert had grown tired of caring for a burden like her. Snow drifted against the door, piling higher with each passing hour. The cold seemed to seep through the cabin walls as if sensing her vulnerability and seeking to reclaim her. Mary wrapped herself in the bundle of furs Robert had given her, clutching them tightly around her shoulders. The knife he'd gifted her rested on the table, a symbol of the trust between them. She ran her fingers over its wooden handle, remembering his words, "You'll need it." Perhaps this was the moment he'd been preparing her for all along. As midnight approached, Mary's old fears returned in full force. The abandonment, the worthlessness, the certainty that she would always end up alone. But something had changed in her during these weeks in the mountain. The lessons Robert had taught her weren't just about survival. They were about believing in herself. This time she resolved not to let her fears win. If Robert was in trouble, he needed her. And if he had truly left her behind, well, he had already given her the tools to survive. Mary squared her shoulders and began to prepare. Tomorrow at first light, she would find answers one way or another. Dawn broke over the mountains with a pale, reluctant light. Mary Johnson wrapped herself in every layer she could find. Robert's spare coat over her own, 2 pairs of woolen socks, and the thick scarf he had taught her to wear properly, covering her nose and mouth against the biting cold. Her hands trembled, not from the chill but from fear that gnawed at her insides. "Robert," she called, her voice immediately stolen by the howling wind. The snow had fallen heavily overnight, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. Mary pushed forward, her boots sinking deep with each step. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. What if he was hurt? What if he was... No! She wouldn't let herself think that way. The young girl forced herself to breathe, to focus on what the mountain man had taught her over these past weeks. "Look for disturbances in the snow," she whispered to herself, recalling his low, patient voice. "Follow the patterns, not just the obvious tracks." Mary scanned the ground methodically, the way Robert had shown her. There, a slight depression where the snow didn't quite match the surrounding drifts. She followed it, moving with growing confidence. The knife he had given her hung at her hip, a comforting weight and reminder of his trust in her. The wind cut through the trees, carrying ice crystals that stung her exposed skin. Yet Mary pressed on, refusing to turn back. She thought of all the people who had abandoned her before, her foster parents, who had left her to freeze in these very woods, the social workers who never noticed her suffering, the teachers who looked away. But Robert was different. He had found her when no one else cared to look. Now it was her turn. 3 hours into her search, Mary spotted a dark shape against the white landscape. Her heart leaped into her throat as she recognized the familiar silhouette of Robert's coat. "Robert," she cried out, pushing her tired legs to move faster through the deep snow. The mountain had claimed many lives over the years. Locals spoke of hikers who never returned, travelers who underestimated its cruel indifference. But Mary was determined it wouldn't claim Robert Brown. Not today. Not when she had finally found someone who saw her worth. With renewed determination, she trudged forward, her eyes fixed on the distant figure. The mountain had tried to take her once before, and Robert had refused to let it happen. Now she would do the same for him, fighting against the elements with every ounce of strength she had gained under his careful guidance. Mary Johnson's heart pounded as she spotted Robert Brown through the swirling snow. He was slumped against a fallen pine, his face streaked with blood that looked almost black in the dim light. Relief flooded through her body with such force that she nearly collapsed beside him. "Robert," she called, her voice stronger than she'd expected. The mountain man looked up, his eyes clouded with pain but unmistakably relieved. "Mary," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. She rushed to his side, noticing the awkward angle of his leg and the deep gash across his forehead. Without hesitation, Mary tore a strip from her innermost layer of clothing and pressed it against the wound. "Can you stand?" she asked, already positioning herself under his arm for support. Robert nodded grimly. With help, the journey back to the cabin was arduous. Every step seemed to cause him pain, but he never complained. Mary found herself drawing on everything he'd taught her, finding the easiest path through the snow, watching for ice patches, keeping them both moving despite exhaustion. The skills he'd shared were now saving them both. When they finally reached the cabin, Mary helped him to his bed, her hands surprisingly steady as she peeled away his blood-soaked clothing. The injuries were worse than she'd initially thought, a deep laceration on his leg, bruises blooming across his ribs, and the cut on his forehead that wouldn't stop bleeding. She worked methodically, cleaning each wound with boiled water from the kettle, just as he had shown her weeks before. When she applied pressure to the leg wound, Robert winced but remained stoic. "What happened?" she whispered, afraid of the answer. Her mind had conjured terrible scenarios during those long hours alone. Had someone attacked him? Had he simply abandoned her like everyone else? Robert closed his eyes briefly. "Tracking a deer. Didn't see the ravine until it was too late." He paused, his breathing labored. "Fell. Hard. Couldn't climb back up right away." Mary nodded, continuing to tend his wound. She found herself using the knife he'd given her to cut strips of clean cloth for bandages. The irony wasn't lost on her, the tool of trust now helping to save its giver. "I thought," she began, then stopped herself. "That I left you?" Robert asked, his eyes finding hers. Mary nodded, ashamed of her doubt. "Never," he said simply. The single word carried the weight of a promise. As she finished binding his wounds, Mary realized something had shifted between them. She was no longer just the girl he'd rescued from the cold. Today, she had been the rescuer. Robert's eyes held a distant look as he stared into the crackling fire. The flames cast long shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines etched by years in the wilderness. Mary Johnson sat beside him, carefully applying a homemade salve to the gash on his arm. Her hands, once trembling and uncertain, now moved with practiced confidence. "What happened?" she whispered again, her voice barely audible above the popping of the burning logs. Robert Brown remained silent, his mind seemingly far away. The cabin creaked around them as wind pushed against its sturdy walls. Outside, snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes, insulating their shelter from the harsh world beyond. Finally, he drew a deep breath. "Found myself trapped under a fallen pine," he explained, his voice rough from disuse. "Leg got pinned. Took hours to work free." He flexed his injured limb with a slight wince. Mary nodded, understanding the dangers of the forest better than most now. She wrapped a clean strip of cloth around his arm, securing the bandage with a knot she'd learned to tie weeks ago. "I've seen the cold take people before," Robert continued, unexpectedly, his eyes meeting hers. Good people, strong people. His calloused hand briefly touched the wooden pendant hanging from his neck, something he never spoke about, but often held during quiet moments. But I'll never let it take you. Not while I'm here. The mountain man's words weren't delivered with dramatic emphasis or unnecessary emotion. They were stated as simple fact, like commenting on the weather or the position of stars. Yet they carried a weight that settled deep within Mary's chest, spreading warmth that had nothing to do with the fire before them. She remembered the night he'd found her, half frozen and abandoned in the woods. How many others had the mountain claimed before Robert's intervention? How many had he been unable to save? Mary busied herself with putting away the medical supplies, hiding the unexpected tears that threatened to spill. For the first time since being left in those freezing woods, she truly believed she might be safe. Not just temporarily sheltered, but genuinely protected by someone who wouldn't discard her when she became inconvenient. "Thank you," she said softly, the words inadequate for what she felt. Robert merely nodded, his eyes returning to the fire. He didn't need elaborate expressions of gratitude. The teenager's growing strength was reward enough. Watching her transform from a frightened, broken child into someone who could survive, perhaps even thrive. Outside, the winter storm raged on, but within the cabin's walls, something profound had shifted. A promise had been made, not just of physical safety, but of something Mary had never truly known before: belonging. The thunder of winter transformed the cabin into a workshop of renewal. Mary Johnson's hands, once tentative and unsure, now moved with growing confidence as she whittled a piece of pine into a crude but effective fishing spear. The knife Robert had given her, once so foreign in her grip, had become an extension of herself. "Look," she said one evening, holding up a small wooden trap she'd designed. Her voice carried a pride that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Robert examined her work with approving eyes. "Better than my first attempt," he admitted, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. His legs still bothered him when the temperature dropped, a reminder of his close call in the wilderness. The mountain man's recovery had shifted their dynamic in unexpected ways. Tasks that once belonged solely to him, checking traps, securing the perimeter, preparing meals, now fell partially to Mary. She embraced these responsibilities, finding strength in being needed rather than merely tolerated. One crisp morning, Mary ventured out alone, following rabbit tracks in the fresh snow. Robert watched from the doorway, concern etched across his weathered face, but he said nothing. Hours later, she returned, cheeks flushed with cold and triumph, a plump rabbit dangling from her makeshift snare. "You did that on your own," he said, the statement carrying more weight than any effusive praise could have. The teenager nodded, her eyes bright. "I remembered everything you taught me." That night, as they shared the rabbit stew, silence settled between them, not the uncomfortable quiet of strangers, but the peaceful stillness of mutual understanding. The cabin, once merely Robert's refuge from the world, had become something different, a place of healing for them both. On nights when the wind howled particularly fiercely, they would sit by the fire, and Robert would share small fragments of his past, tales of mistakes made and lessons learned the hard way. Mary listened intently, recognizing the gift in his willingness to reveal these pieces of himself. In return, she began to speak of her own journey through foster homes, of the small betrayals and disappointments that had hardened her heart long before the cold of Pinebrook Woods had nearly claimed her life. "The mountain doesn't care about your past," Robert told her one evening, stoking the fire. "It only cares if you're strong enough to face tomorrow." Mary considered his words, rolling them over in her mind like smooth river stones. The mountain had nearly taken her life, but in Robert's cabin, surrounded by tools they'd crafted together, she realized it had also given her something invaluable, a future worth fighting for. The first signs of spring emerged across the ridge as patches of green pushed through melting snow. Mary Johnson stood at the cabin entrance, watching nature's transformation with a mixture of wonder and unease. The mountain had become her sanctuary, but a growing restlessness stirred within her heart. "I think it's time," she said one evening as Robert tended the fire. Her voice was stronger now, no longer the frightened whisper of the girl he'd found half frozen in the woods. Robert looked up, his weathered face revealing no surprise. He'd sensed this moment, approaching with the changing season. The mountain man simply nodded, understanding what remained unspoken between them. "Pinebrook," he said, the name hanging in the air like a challenge. Mary wrapped her fingers around the sturdy knife at her belt, the first gift he'd given her. "I can't hide forever as people, foster parents. I need to face them." Over the next few days they prepared methodically. Robert gathered supplies with the same careful attention he'd shown when teaching her to survive. He packed dried meat, extra clothing, and tools that might prove useful in town. Each item was selected with purpose, a testament to his protective nature. "The journey down takes less than a day," he explained, showing her the route on a hand-drawn map. "But the real journey begins when we reach town." Mary nodded, anxiety and determination battling within her. She'd grown stronger during these winter months, not just physically but in spirit. The girl who had collapsed in the snow would have never imagined confronting those who had abandoned her. The night before their departure, Mary sat by the fireplace, watching flames dance across the logs. "What if they don't care that I'm alive?" she whispered. Robert settled beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Their reaction doesn't define your worth," he said simply. "You survived, you thrived. That's what matters." Dawn broke clear and crisp as they secured the cabin. Mary took one last look at the place that had saved her life. The small wooden structure had transformed from a stranger's shelter to a home filled with hard-earned lessons and unexpected kindness. They began their descent with the rising sun at their back. Robert led his horse carefully down the narrow path while Mary walked alongside, her steps purposeful. The mountain man occasionally glanced at his young companion, noting the straight set of her shoulders and determined gaze. Pinebrook waited below, nestled in the valley like a collection of tiny boxes. Mary could almost feel the weight of memories and confrontations that awaited her there. But this time she wouldn't face them alone. Mary Johnson's heart hammered against her ribs as she and Robert Brown descended from the mountains into Pinebrook. The familiar streets felt alien now, as if she were walking through a dream. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the sturdy knife Robert had given her, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of her newfound strength. "You don't have to do this today," Robert murmured, his weathered face creased with concern. "I do," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The spring air carried none of winter's bite, yet Mary shivered. Pinebrook was exactly as she remembered. The small general store, the modest homes with their neat yards, the church steeple rising above the trees. But she was different now. The mountain had changed her. As they walked down Main Street, conversations halted, heads turned, eyes widened. To these people, Mary was a ghost. The foster child who had vanished during the worst blizzard in years. No search parties had been organized. No posters had been hung. They had simply assumed the worst and moved on.
Now,
"Isn't that the Johnson girl?" someone whispered loudly. "Lord above, we thought she was dead." Another voice added. Mary kept her chin up, Robert's silent presence beside her like a fortress. She wasn't the same frightened girl who had fled into the woods months ago. Her once frail frame now carried the resilience of someone who had tracked animals through snow, chopped wood until her hands blistered, and faced down the mountain's harshest offerings. When they reached the corner of Elm Street, Mary spotted them, her former foster parents, the Millers, loading groceries into their vehicle. Mrs. Miller saw her first, freezing mid-motion, a bag clutched to her chest. She nudged her husband, whose face drained of color upon seeing Mary. The couple averted their eyes, shame and guilt etched into every line of their faces. They had left her to freeze, had chosen not to search, had likely told themselves comforting lies about her fate. In the past, Mary would have shrunk away, made herself invisible. But the mountains had taught her that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about standing tall even when the wind threatened to break you. "Hello," she said simply, her voice carrying across the quiet street. The town of Pinebrook held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But Mary wasn't there for drama or revenge. She was there to reclaim her place in the world, to show herself and everyone else that she was no longer someone who could be discarded and forgotten. Robert stood silently beside her, a guardian mountain in human form, as Mary took her first steps toward confronting the past that had nearly claimed her life. The town hall of Pinebrook, had never felt so small. Mary Johnson stood at its center, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. The faces of her former foster parents, the Wilsons, were pale with shock as they sat in the front row, unable to look away from the girl they had abandoned to the winter's mercy. "I'm not here for your pity," Mary said, her fingers instinctively touching the knife Robert had given her, now tucked safely in her pocket. "I'm here because the truth deserves to be spoken." The room fell silent. Even the usual whispers that followed her through town had ceased. Mary described that night, the argument, the locked doors, the desperate walk into the woods. She spoke without tears, though many in the audience couldn't say the same. "You left me to die," she told the Wilsons directly. "But I'm standing here because someone else chose differently." Robert Brown remained at the back of the room, his weathered face impassive. He had insisted on coming, but refused to stand beside her. "This is your moment," he had told her that morning. "Your voice needs no shadow." The mountain man watched as his protégé commanded the attention of everyone present. The frail girl he'd found half frozen beneath the pines had transformed. Her shoulders were squared, her gaze unwavering. "I don't want your guilt," Mary continued. "What I want is for you to see me, really see me, and know that when you abandon someone, you don't get to decide their story ends there." Mrs. Wilson attempted to speak, her excuses dying on her lips as Mary raised her hand. "There are other children in this town who need protection," the teenager said. "That's why I'm speaking today. Not for revenge, but because silence protects the wrong people." The town council members exchanged uncomfortable glances. The sheriff shifted in his seat. Mary had touched a nerve that Pine Brook had long tried to ignore. As she finished speaking, Robert finally moved, walking slowly to stand near but not beside her. His presence was a quiet affirmation. He didn't need to speak. His being there said everything. Mary looked at her former foster parents one last time. "I forgive you," she said, "not for their benefit, but for her own. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." As they left the town hall together, Robert placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he said simply. Mary nodded, feeling lighter than she had in years. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time she knew with absolute certainty that she would win. In the weeks that followed her confrontation, Mary Johnson walked through Pine Brook with her head held high. The town that had once seemed so threatening now felt smaller, more manageable. She found work at the local general store, where her newfound confidence and resilience impressed the owner enough to give her a chance. Despite her young age, Mary began sharing what she had learned in the mountains. On weekends, she taught a small group of interested townspeople how to identify edible plants and set basic traps. "These skills saved my life," she would say quietly, her fingers tracing the handle of the sturdy knife that never left her side. The blade had become more than a tool. It was a reminder of the trust Robert had placed in her when no one else would. Robert Brown remained on the outskirts of town, still preferring the solitude of his cabin to the bustle of Pine Brook. Yet he ventured down more frequently now, usually arriving on horseback at the edge of town where Mary would meet him. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could have predicted, a bond forged in ice and strengthened through shared survival. "You don't need me anymore," he told her one afternoon as they walked along the tree line, the spring air soft around them. Mary shook her head. "That's not how it works," she replied. "We need each other differently now." The teenager's former foster parents made awkward attempts at reconciliation, but Mary maintained a careful distance. She had forgiven them not for their sake but for her own, yet she understood some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. Instead, she focused on creating new connections, including volunteering at the town's youth center, where other struggling kids could benefit from her unique perspective. By summer, Mary had saved enough money to rent a small room above the bookstore. It wasn't much, but it was hers, the first space she could truly call her own. Robert helped her move in, carrying bundles up the narrow staircase, his weathered hands steady and sure. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted, as they stood in the modest room, sunlight streaming through the single window. The mountain man nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You built this future," he said simply. "I just helped you stay warm enough to find it." As Pine Brook prepared for another winter, Mary no longer feared the cold. She had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding warmth in unexpected places and having the courage to share that warmth with others. No longer the lost girl in the woods, Mary had become a beacon for those still searching for their way home.